You know how it is you're following the news, and sometimes it feels like there's this constant um, push and pull. The president wants one thing, then the courts step in.
Yeah.
It really makes you wonder about the mechanics of our government, right? Like who's really driving and what does it mean?
It definitely highlights the checks and balances that core principle we're supposed to operate under.
Exactly. And today we're diving into one specific situation that got a lot of people talking. It's about a judge who put the brakes on a Trump administration policy. Our main source for this deep dive is a discussion from the Ring of Fire YouTube channel, specifically their video, Judge Puts a Halt on Trump's Mandate.
Right. And it's useful to remember that source likely has its own perspective, which is part of the landscape we're exploring.
For sure. Our goal isn't just to repeat what they said, but to really get into the different layers. What were the legal arguments? How did the public see it? And, what does this specific instance tell us about the bigger picture? The rule of law, the court's role. Okay, so the video starts by setting up this tension. We mentioned this perception that sometimes the judiciary seems to be getting in the way of what an elected president wants to do.
And that immediately brings up this fascinating dynamic, doesn't it? The idea of the will of the people versus the judiciary's role as a check on power. It forces us to ask, well, when is judicial intervention seen as okay and when isn't it?
Yeah, and the video flags a pretty serious concern. If people start thinking judges are just, blocking things based on politics, what happens to their trust in the whole system? That seems really crucial.
It's absolutely fundamental. The courts don't get their power from elections, right?
Yeah.
They get it from public trust that they're impartial, that they're following the law. If that trust goes away, well, the whole idea of the rule of law starts to wobble.
So let's get specific. The legal hook here, according to the video, is the Alien Enemies Act of 1798. I mean, that sounds ancient.
It is old, but its history is really key here. It came about when the U.S. was worried about maybe going to war with France. The whole point was to give the president power over non-citizens from enemy nations during wartime.
Okay, so it wasn't just pulled out of thin air for this situation. It has a past. The video mentioned it popped up in the War of 1812, World War I, Wilson used it, and World War II as well. That's quite a history of presidents using it in big conflicts. Why do you think that context sometimes gets lost?
Well, often the immediate political heat of a situation just overshadows everything else, It's simpler to paint a judge's decision as purely political if you ignore the actual law they're looking at and how it's been used before. The video rightly points out that history matters here.
Absolutely. So the video describes the judge making this move, issuing a temporary injunction. That basically stopped the policy cold, right? What's the usual reason a judge does that?
So a temporary injunction is basically a pause button. A court uses it to stop something while they take a longer look at whether it's actually legal. Usually a judge grants one if they think, okay, there's a decent chance this policy is unlawful, and letting it happen now could cause harm that can't be undone later. It keeps things as they are until they figure it out.
And the video really emphasizes how the public, or at least a part of it, reacted. The feeling described was, hey, people voted for Trump, he has a mandate, why is this one judge allowed to stop him?
And that throws us right back to that core conflict, doesn't it? Election results versus legal limits. Our system means winning an election doesn't give the president a blank check. The courts are there partly to make sure everyone, even the president, follows the Constitution and the laws. But yeah, when a judge blocks something popular, it can definitely feel frustrating to supporters.
And the video's argument is that this feeling, this idea that maybe the courts aren't neutral, is actually dangerous for the rule of law itself. If people see courts as just another political player, what happens down the road?
The long-term effects could be pretty serious. If trust goes down, people might start to doubt court decisions generally. It makes it harder for courts to do their job, to settle disputes, uphold laws. And it could, invite even more political pressure onto judges.
Okay, so the video then gets into the core legal question. Did the Alien Enemies Act even apply here? The whole debate, as they lay it out, was whether the situation counted as war or an incursion or invasion, the specific triggers in that old law.
Exactly. The 1798 Act is very clearly linked to declared war or invasion. So the legal fight was likely about whether the facts on the ground met that specific legal definition. That's where interpretation comes in, and courts have to decide what those words mean in the context of this law.
And the video stresses that asking that question, does the law apply, is a perfectly legitimate thing for a court to do. It's separate from whether you like the policy or not.
Oh, completely. That's literally the judiciary's job.
Yeah.
Interpret the law. Figuring out if a specific law fits a specific situation is, well, it's what they do. It's not about politics or popularity.
But the video also talks about the blowback this judge faced. A lot of heat, people digging into their past, their connections. The perception for some was that this wasn't about law, it was political. What does that kind of pressure do?
That kind of intense scrutiny, especially when it feels personal or politically driven, can really undermine judicial independence. Judges need to feel they can rule based on the law without, fearing personal attacks or being labeled purely partisan. There's a line between accountability and intimidation, and sometimes it gets blurry.
And the video does note that technically the judge was using a standard tool, the temporary injunction, because they had real legal doubts about whether this statute fit the situation. That's built into the process, isn't it?
Precisely. A temporary injunction isn't the final word, it's just a timeout. The judge was basically saying, hold on, we need to examine if this specific law is the right tool here before we let this policy proceed.
But then the discussion in the video pivots slightly. It suggests that maybe the judiciary, especially the lower courts, need to be careful, strategic about when they step in and block a president. The worry they raise is if it happens too much and it looks political, it could hurt how people see the courts overall.
That's a really interesting point about judicial restraint, maybe, and the risk of appearing like they're overreaching. The video implies that if lower courts seem to be constantly blocking the president, especially on hot-button issues, it could feed this narrative that they're just political players, not neutral refs.
And they use the FBI as an example to make this point. The argument is that the FBI's credibility took a hit because some people felt they got tangled up in politics. Do you see that parallel?
It's an interesting comparison. The core idea is that institutions meant to be impartial, whether law enforcement or the judiciary, can lose public trust if they get drawn into partisan fights. People start questioning their motives, their objectivity.
Right. And the video even floats the idea of, well, look what might happen to the FBI restructuring, shuffling people around kind of as a warning sign for the courts. Like, if courts get seen the same way, could they face similar political fallout? It's definitely something to think about.
It does raise that uncomfortable question about how political pressure might eventually impact even supposedly independent bodies if public confidence really tanks.
Now, the video also brings up due process, specifically in immigration cases, which was probably relevant to whatever policy Trump had put forward. They make the point that the legal standard for due process there isn't always as high as, say, in a criminal case. Can you explain that a bit?
Generally speaking, yeah. The level of due process needed in immigration matters is often seen as less extensive than what's required if someone's facing criminal charges. It still has to be fundamentally fair, but the specific procedures and protections might not be identical. It's complex, often debated legally, but that's the general understanding.
And the video's take seems to be that because that bar might be lower, the executive branch usually has room to maneuver and get its policies done within the law. The real problem, as they frame it, is when judges seem to be blocking things, not because due process was clearly violated, but because they just don't like the policy politically.
Which loops back to that central issue of perception, right? If court challenges look like they're mainly about politics, not about clear legal or constitutional problems, especially concerning due process, it just fuels that narrative of a politicized judiciary.
But the video isn't only critical of the courts. It actually criticizes the executive branch too, specifically President Trump, for how they reacted. They call for more patience, less immediate finger pointing. Why is that kind of restraint important from everyone involved?
Well, keeping the rhetoric focused on the legal process rather than personal attacks helps maintain the system's integrity. When leaders immediately lash out at judges or other branches, it just ramps up public anger and can erode faith in the institutions themselves. A calmer approach lets the legal questions be considered more rationally.
Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive based on the Ring of Fire video, what are the main things we should take away?
I think first, it really underscores that natural tension between executive power and judicial review that's just built into our system. Second, knowing the history of laws like the Alien Enemies Act is crucial. It's not just an abstract debate. Third, how the public perceives the courts is incredibly important for their legitimacy. And finally, that interesting point about whether courts, especially lower ones, need to think strategically about interventions in highly political areas.
Right. So here's something to maybe mull over. We've got this complex dance between following the law, respecting election outcomes, and how public opinion shapes everything. When these big branches of government seem to clash, what are the ripple effects long term? And how much does what we think public perception actually influence the power and legitimacy of our government institutions? Definitely food for thought.